It is a year and a half since Kenya registered her first COVID-19 case. The economy has borne the brunt of the pandemic, leaving a limping economy. Millions of job losses standing at about 1.7 million people. Small businesses are slowly struggling to bounce back. On the front row, we take a look at the state of the sector, the impact on operations and the role of the government and the private sector in the war against the COVID-19. I'm sitting in for my colleague Akisa Wandera, and this is the front row with me, Abi Agina. We have a set of interesting guests who will help guide this all-important conversation. But first, let's begin with a quick look at their profiles. Well, on the program today, we are delighted to have the presence of Honorable David Osiany, who is the Chief Administrative Secretary for the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development, a policy analyst and a communication specialist with extensive multi-sectoral experience in public policy, strategic communications and government relations. Also on the program, we have with us Mr. Victor Otieno, who is the Managing Director of Vifa Consult, a consulting outfit that offers SMEs research and data analytics capabilities that drives unmatched and sustained competitive advantage. He holds an MBA in entrepreneurship and is also a certified public accountant of Kenya. Well, last but not least, we have our other guests joining us from our city center studios, and we are honored to have with us Mr. Samuel Matonda, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. With over 24 experience on hands-on experience, he specializes in international trade development, business counseling services, business advocacy, sustainable socio-economic community development, among others. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is a quick look at the very high-level panel that we have this particular day. But before we get into it, let's take a look at our Twitter poll question, and we are asking you, do you think the government has sufficiently supported small businesses during the pandemic? That is our Twitter poll question. We have opened our lines as well. You can engage with us and also shoot your questions to our panelists to help drive this conversation. Do you think the government has sufficiently supported small businesses during the pandemic? You can tweet us at KTN News KE. You can also tweet me at Agina Abi. Our hashtag for this conversation is Front Row. Well, let's set the stage with this report, where the private sector players will support government efforts to import and distribute COVID-19 vaccines. This follows an order by the government in a bid to increase vaccination in the country and fully open up the economy. Well, our very own Brenda Kerubo has more.
COVID-19 infections are increasing in the country, with nearly 900 new infections reported on average each day. Even with restrictions in place, the disease keeps spreading. Business leaders attending this briefing by the Cabinet Secretary for Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development, Betty Maina, agreed the only solution to avert a full lockdown and drive up business activities is to increase vaccination.
The more we see, and I think the more we see other variants are coming in, we're really never going to be out of the woods globally unless we have rollout and massive vaccination so that you can have economic activity without a lot of disruption.
The private sector will now be able to participate in the COVID-19 vaccine supply chain amid strict regulations from the government. This includes accreditation on sourcing the vaccine and quantities supplied.
We currently have committed to 1 million vaccines as private sector, where we are working with government, where they will purchase on our behalf. And we have also committed to help them roll out and sort of build our herd immunity, because the faster we get to herd immunity, the faster we'll be able to open up our economy and do what we really want to do, which is to do business.
The government puts in a lot of money, yes, but then of course when you are in private sector, we are supposed to mobilize, or we are able to mobilize resources which can go into that. And when the vaccines come, of course, the vaccinations will also be conducted using private facilities as well, because in the past it has been solely the government.
Kenya has vaccinated about 1.7 million people, of whom some 700,000 or 2.37% of adults are fully vaccinated. Business operators say a return to normalcy in the business environment is attributed to increased rollout of the COVID vaccine.
Remember, this is similar to even the other vaccinations that are done for polio and for all the other diseases. Initially, it was government taking sole responsibility, but later, of course, the private sector is given an allowance and given permission, and they're given that authority to do the importation. So that's exactly what it is, but it's controlled in such a manner that we are not able to procure that which is not authorized by government.
President Uhuru Kenyatta's administration has set a target of at least 10 million Kenyans to be vaccinated by Christmas this year and 26 million people by the end of next year. Brenda Kirubu, KTN News.
All right. Thank you, Brenda, for opening it up for us for our conversation on the front row. Remember, our hashtag is front row. You can get us on our Twitter handles at KTN News KE or at Agina Abbey. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us for this very important discussion. I hope we've all gotten the jab.
Yeah, well, I know I'm jabbed.
All right. Victor, did you get your...
I actually got COVID, so isolated for the 2 weeks, so don't worry.
Have you been jabbed, Victor?
So when you get COVID, you need 6 months before you can get the jab.
All right.
At least.
Really?
That's what I got.
That's a story for another day. Thank you. Well, I know Mr. Matonda from our City Center studio is also listening in on this, and welcome as well on the show. But let me start it off with the CAS for industrialization, that is Mr. David Osiany. A lot of hope coming to a time and space where the economy is yet to get back on its feet. There's still some slowdown where the COVID containment measures have affected businesses across the country, across the region, and also world over. For Kenya, the real situation continues to bite. Listening to that report, the vaccines are coming in. They are likely to give us a new lifeline. But from where we sit, how ravaged is our economy, and is there hope for small businesses?
Thank you very much, Abby. First, it's a delight to be back at KTN after quite a while. I need to say that there has been a global problem because of the COVID pandemic. And so the situation we find ourselves in is foremost not unique to Kenya. But because we have not had, we are not in the vantage position of enjoying massive doses of vaccines, we have continued with this problem. As you may be aware, our infection rate stands at about 15%, which is extremely high. And so we looked at the current situation where there's a risk of loss of lives still, with COVID continuing to, rage. Yet also there is an economy that we are charged as a ministry to try and ensure it gets back on its feet somewhat. And yesterday, my cabinet secretary, Madam Betty Maina, then called the business leaders and said, guys, you have to be at the forefront of leading other business people to understand that they must do their place in ensuring that we observe the laid down protocols and guidelines so that then we do not stare at the possibility of having the measures we had in place before, which nearly crippled business. Actually, not nearly. It actually did. In some situations, factories that have operated for years closed down. I mean, the Intercontinental, for example, shut its doors. The Radisson Blu Hotel, massive investment in Upper Hill, closed down. Small businesses alike were hit hard. And so we've left this at the feet of the business people themselves to see for themselves that they must lead in a call for responsibility. And if they do not do that, then they risk to bear the brunt of the decisions that will come thereafter. Because we cannot continue looking at the infection rate going that high, do nothing about it. We are still not able, because we do not produce vaccines of our own. I'm grateful to the president that in his visit in the UK, he was able to secure about 800,000 doses of vaccines of AstraZeneca, 410,000 of which are already in country. But that's such a little amount of vaccines. We have a long way to go.
Yeah.
And a short time to get there.
All right.
So as leaders, ours is to urge responsibility.
Speaking about responsibility,
yeah.
So really, what is the state of industry? Are we likely to see things changing down the road now that we're talking of more vaccines coming?
Well, you know, a better vaccinated population would mean that we are less infected. The question is, does the global supply chain assure us of much more vaccines, as much vaccines as we would want? I'm not too sure that's the case. But I'm glad that there's now been the next step of allowing the private sector to procure vaccines, so that those who can afford can be able to buy. KEPSA has led by purchasing 1 million, which is as part of a donation to the country, and many others are going to be able to bring in vaccines, both for donation and for sale, or whatever it is, regulated by the Ministry of Health. If we have a better vaccinated populace, then we can get back to our businesses as usual. The net effect of that then is our economy will be doing much better. We'll start improving quite rapidly. But without that, we are still going to have a situation where there's this general fear. The Ministry of Health is saying, this is what the numbers are saying. We are not going to allow you to die in pursuit of money. And the people are saying, no, 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 we'd rather died in pursuit than died hungry at home.
All right.
So we, a catch-22 situation. But we really hope that we will get sufficient vaccines. Then it will have played a major role in helping us to re-engineer the country after this crazy pandemic.
All right. I know we'll be getting to hear more from you on interventions by the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Before we come back to Victor, I'd like to rope in Mr. Samuel Matonda, joining us from our City Center studios. And I understand we'll be crossing over to him in a short while. But let me take it back to Victor. Speaking from SMEs, you handle a lot of data. You've worked with a number of startups, and clearly speaking, listening to the president when he addressed the country on the first anniversary of COVID in March, he indicated that our economy was severely ravaged, with the economy GDP value being wiped out by about 560 billion shillings. This is not small money for an economy of our size. What has been the impact on SMEs that you interact with? Have some been wiped off completely? Are others tinkering on the verge of collapse? What is the situation like?
So I think the state of play for SMEs has been dire for the last 5 years. I think COVID-19 was almost like the last nail on the coffin. If you look at the last 5 years or so, we are looking at elections, repeat elections, we are looking at interest rate cap, we are looking at drought. And the hope was that coming to 2020, it would be the year of recovery before the general elections.
Sure.
Then COVID hit. So if you look prior to 2020, we were having a death rate or mortality rate of around 75% of SMEs dying within the first 3 years. Coming to 2020, of course, with COVID, that rate has really, really gone high. And of course, that situation is not as good. Going by the interventions that government put out through the economic stimulus program, if you're to compare that with the World Bank report called the long shadow of informality, the report indicates or says that it's very difficult for you to use conventional stimulus program to a grey economy or an economy where SMEs are informal. And if you're to compare that against the interventions that came out through the economic stimulus program, which was highly, highly formal in the sense of tax breaks, working through getting cash credit through CBK, then we see that that intervention was not as optimal in terms of supporting SMEs. So SMEs still are, in the trenches, just trying to struggle.
Interesting. And speaking to the Mama Mbogas listening to us on this program, there seems to be literally no bailout program again. We've seen the government has been quite silent on this. I'm hoping Mr. Osiany will elaborate more on this, but perhaps what sort of a bailout would be ideal? Again,
focusing on the World Bank report, it gave recommendations in terms of how to really support SMEs where a majority of them are informal. So one of the things they were talking about is income support. If a country goes through a lockdown or restricted movements, SMEs, with the majority of them being in wholesale retail, can't sell. So number one is having income support, in the sense of being able to give them money for the lost income because of a lockdown. Number two is social protection, in the sense of either giving food aid or cash grants to the families affected who operate in SMEs. Number three is to, because of the informal nature of SMEs, normal registries of businesses don't work. So it proposes an innovative way of looking for actual verified registry where these SMEs are, and using technology, either M-Pesa, etc., to be able to use it as a channel to give them the interventions. So those are the recommendations that we've seen from the World Bank report, and I think those can be applied in Kenya.
I'm seeing Honorable Osiany is itching to respond. Just hold it there. Let me bring in Mr. Matonda, who I understand will be joining us in a short while. We are working to re-establish that link with him so that he can also chip in on this discussion. It takes me back to Honorable Osiany. We are seeing countries like in the US, people are getting transfers for getting the jab.
Yeah.
For Kenya, I know we cannot compare the two countries, definitely.
Yeah.
But it speaks volumes on just how we've managed this pandemic. And from where you sit as government, what sort of interventions are we looking at that are likely to be practical and impactful to the common man down on the street?
I partly agree with what Victor is saying, but what he's running away from is that in trying to talk about informality, he wants to overlook the role of formalization, and that the arrangement and organization of European countries, which is an investment that has been made over years, is not something we have been able to enjoy just yet. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to say cash bailouts, for example, to our to the very micro sectors, you will not even be able to get a credible list of the micro sector. You will end up with someone claiming that they sell boga when everyone in the village knows they do not. You will end up with a situation where someone claims that they are mechanics when that may not be the case. And hence, a very clear focus on formalization of the informal sector, a journey towards formalization. As I have said before, I do not want us to bury our heads in sand and then say, no, customize everything for the informal sector. Of course, it is the charge and mandate of the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development to do that, which we are attempting now to do, having put in place a registrar of the Micro and Small Enterprise Authority, whose mandate will be working together with our officers in the field to try and create a credible database and data bank of all our micro and small entrepreneurs across the country. Granted, that's not going to take a short while. Now, the government, and this is where I agree with Victor, that the interventions made therefore were looking more towards the organized and the formalized sector. So we had a turnover tax that was cut down from 3% to 1%, which is quite significant. Reduce that by actually 70%, or the 67% or thereabouts.
Sure.
You had the corporate tax reduced from 30% to 25%. You had, at the very basic level, for income earners, though they may not be enterprises, but income earners of 24,000 shillings and below, which is the majority of the income earners, given 100% tax relief during COVID. Of course, some of these measures have now been reinstated because we were grinding towards a halt.
Yeah.
And you also need to know that the president gave a directive that Treasury releases 13 billion shillings during COVID that was held in monies that were not yet paid out to various SMEs and companies that were long overdue. And said, these pending bills, pay them out. And that payment in and of itself was a huge boost, and counties were directed to pay their pending bills effective immediately. Now, what I'm saying is, for our micro sectors, because I would be proud to see a Mama Mboga who transited into running a grocery, who then transited into running a wholesale supermarket for selling vegetables. That journey is not possible without focusing on formalization. And so we, as a ministry, whereas we are keeping this data bank and finding interventions for that sector at that level, we are also urging them to appreciate that unless you formalize, unless you know how to even run your books or have an account of sorts, it may be impossible to even access the credit guarantee scheme. The president put, the government put aside 3 billion shillings as seed capital for the credit guarantee fund, but which will be run by about 7 banks. Now, you aren't able to access that advantage until you appreciate that formalizing is a pathway to helping and growing yourself from micro to small, from small to medium. That growth is what will strengthen our economy, in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And taking it back to you, Honorable Siany, the SMEs play a vital role in our economy. They are said to be the cogs that drive the economy.
Definitely.
And from the various interventions you're talking about, they are quite noble. But how do we scale this up? Because the rate at which the pandemic has extended beyond unimaginable timelines.
Yeah.
It's quite unfortunate.
Yeah.
No one knows when we'll fully contain it.
Yeah.
Is the government still going back to the drawing board and saying, how can we re-strategize, especially when it comes to expanding the programs that are currently in place, and also what innovations is the ministry supporting that are related to the health sector, that are seeing SMEs developing quite innovative aspects like the ventilators, the masks, because for us to achieve full recovery, we also need to, of course, give them a lift.
At the height of COVID, remember, about 105 companies that were working on PPEs were given expedited clearance with absolute guidance by the Kenya Bureau of Standards, which is under my ministry. And that was also to show that we want to support our local organizations and companies to become part of the solutions in this problem. Appreciate that this is the first time that Kenya is having to deal with a pandemic. We have not been ravaged by Ebola like our neighboring Uganda country before. We escaped the tragedy of SARS. This is the first time we have had to deal with a pandemic. And so we found ourselves in a situation where we really had to try hard. I mean, credit goes to the team at the Ministry of Health, Dr. Amoth, Mutai Kagwe, Susan Mochache, that whole team that has spearheaded this, the fight against COVID. But from a ministry perspective, there is just so much that we can do. Even America, that is the world leader, he is looking at having to stop bailouts because it's not sustainable. Now, we are generating local solutions for our local problems, cognizant of the fact that this pandemic may be here with us for a long time. And that's why we are saying, let us seek interventions. Let us first behave in a manner that appreciates that this pandemic, first, it kills. Secondly, it's here with us for long. And thirdly, we cannot shut down the country forever at the expense of the economy. So the ministry has put in place all these other raft of measures. You know that the government started Kazi kwa Vijana. Kazi kwa Vijana was faced towards this SME or micro and small enterprise sector, the young people who would otherwise be in these sectors that have now been kicked out of business, and we sought alternative mechanisms of income for them, and many others that have been in place. The ministry, for the first time this year, we have launched the micro and small enterprise policy. And I invite us to have a look at it. It proposes how we are going to sufficiently support, hoping we get out of this mess so that we have sufficient resources to pump towards micro and small enterprise sector. But it pronounces itself very clearly on our pathway towards growing the micro-small enterprise sector. Remember also that the manufacturing sector is one of the pillars, of the four agenda legacy, the big four agenda, which is the president's legacy agenda. It focuses on trying to create the manufacturers or industries within the country. Recently, last week in Meru, we said we want to see if in the next 1 year, with the support of everybody within and our partners without, we can create cottage industries, one industry in one village. It is such a huge dream. But if we can only achieve 30% in the next 9 months, we will have done enough for country.
Interesting. And Victor, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. One industry, one village. We are used to one cow, one village.
Maybe I just wanted to comment around the issue of informality and formalization.
Yes.
Number one, we know that around 93% of the people we are calling SMEs are micro. So at where they are now, the cost benefit of formalization is too high. They can't be able to formalize. So I think number one is we need to look at an incentive.
When you talk about cost, just expound a bit.
So these are businesses that have an annual turnover of less than 500,000. Just look at just you trying to formalize and get business.
These are the young men and women down in Gikomba.
Yes. So these are very small
markets.
These are very small businesses. Yeah. So formalization is out of the question for them now. But I think there has to be conversations around developing a framework to incentivize them to be able to formalize. Yeah. Which, of course, if you have more money, then you can have time to have conversation around formalization. That's number one. Number two is, yes, I agree that a government can be able to create a database of sorts for SMEs. But the question is, when SMEs are struggling, what can we do now? And the proposal that we've put out there, and based on our own research, we are seeing that a lot of SMEs are within chamas. And a lot of these chamas are registered in some way by government or whatever. So either the chamas could be with a bank, could be a church, could be an NGO, could be whatever. Of course, there is a way you can be able to verify members of a chama within whichever organizations that they are in. So there is a short-term interventions that we can do based on the chamas, because these are already registered either through bank, then through government, and use that to give at least short-term remedy, even as government in the long run is trying to build its own database.
Which is absolutely agreeable.
Yes.
And now that speaks to formalization of some sort.
I agree.
Okay. And yesterday, Madam Honorable Betty Maina said, this is what we are encouraging, that be part of a group. It's easier to get assistance as part of a group. Of course, cooperatives, which is the State Department in charge of the chamas, was hived off the Ministry of Industrialization and Trade and Enterprise Development and moved to the Ministry of Agriculture. It would be much easier, and I'd speak a little more authoritatively, if it fell under our purview at the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development.
Right.
But I agree that with that, then we start talking about which is the way, and which has been done before. Not too long ago, we were in Meru, where the Micro and Small Enterprise Authority, MSEA, had gone to sign a pact to support the micro traders at the bottom level with an initial 80 million shillings amount, which was to be given to, the 5,000, 10,000 that guarantees you stock for today and tomorrow. Now, the Micro and Small Enterprise Authority is also waiting to get sufficient resources. The net effect of COVID has been that Kenyans are cash-strapped,
yes,
and so is the country. Businesses from which government can gain their tax and resources are struggling. There isn't enough in the pot. It is almost impossible then to entirely focus on immediate release of cash to offset some of this when the pot itself is struggling and a bit dry. There's education to take care of, there are hospitals to take care of, there are businesses struggling, so you can only distribute yourself too thin.
All right. Speaking about spreading yourself too thin, for how long, Bwana Waziri, will SMEs remain a crying sector? And yet we say they are the cogs that drive our economy. What government intervention do we need to now relook at when it comes to, for example, tax incentives, when it comes to preferential treatment? Because I liked what you said, where you'd like to see the Mama Mboga transitioning into a wholesaler to the level where they are a retailer and they're up in the chain.
Yeah. You know, conversations around preferential treatments began way before the pandemic came. You know that there is access to government procurement opportunities, which is a decision, which is a presidential directive that stated that businesses owned by youth, women, and persons with disability would be given 30% of the budget of all organizations across the country. Whether or not this has been adhered to is subject to the boards that run these parastatals and organizations to ensure that this has been done. But there's also been a challenge around access of affordable funds, which we have tried to utilize through the Kenya Industrial Estates to disburse the funds. But you know, the tragedy of a bad credit culture has only meant that the rules put down are a bit too strict. Why? Because when we had the youth fund, where the rules were laxed, a lot of the organizations and people took loans, they never returned. What has happened, therefore, is that they have sadly ended up spoiling for the people who came after them, because all organizations that are releasing money do not want a default rate that's more than, let's say, 8 or 10%. And that was the same with the Women Fund. There have to be conversations around how to improve on this credit culture so that people understand that when you take money, which is the problem we have with the Higher Education Loans Board, of which I am a beneficiary, and I did my part within 2 years by God's grace. Not everyone may be able to, but the willingness to show that you are committed towards defraying the costs that put you up there for the sake of others are conversations we need to have constantly and repeatedly. And so the incentives and giving SMEs preferential treatment is not a thing of yesterday. But let's agree that for as long as COVID is here with us, as we try to innovate, there will be a bit of a struggle. Appreciate also that we finally, as I said, have a policy that will look at all these multi-sectors involved in the conversation around SMEs. It is not entirely domiciled with us at the ministry. When you talk about tax bans, which I think we have been promoters of, you know, at the ministry, and we are having conversations around, that one also pulls in Treasury. And we are unable to speak on their behalf.
All right. Well said. Thank you, Honorable Sianyi. Well, want to go on a quick commercial break. We are, of course, going to also be roping in our other panelists joining us from our City Center studios. We have him sorted out right now. That is Mr. Samuel Matonda, the CEO of the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. When we come back, we'll be looking at a very interesting topic. How can we boost innovations for small businesses to ensure there is sustainability and survival? All this after this break on Front Row.